Hello, class. This is Mr. Schmidt with our December 3rd recap of the classification systems. So we had quite a lot to talk about today as we talked about the classification of life. So biology and zoology is going to go over a lot of this, but it's important that we understand how everything breaks down and the different pieces of how things are categorized, and then we can finally talk about the environmental science of how they interact. So students will be able to explain how organisms are named in the classification system. All right, so classifications put organisms into groups by looking at characteristics or traits that they share. So if we go back to the 1600s and 1700s, there are a lot of people just kind of doing stamp collecting type biology and botany. They're putting things together based on characteristics. Big things over here, green things over there, and they started gathering them and sorting them, and patterns started to emerge. Okay, once they had those patterns, they could start naming things and classifying them into groups based on their structure. And now we can start classifying them based on their DNA and other traits. Okay, so we're going to see the same process over and over again as we go from like all living things down to animals, and then farther and farther, more detailed till we get down to one species here. Okay, so this process was brought to us most notably from one scientist, Linus, okay, Sweden, 18 or 1700s, came up with this phrase, the binomial nomenclature. And this process, this naming convention is still true. So he was the first to publish it, so we're going to give him credit for coming up with this binomial nomenclature. We're going to use two words to classify all living organisms within the scientific vocabulary. Okay, so binomial, bi meaning two. Okay, so it is a two-word name. Traditionally, they used Latin words. Now, if you discover your own species, you have a fairly wide range of options of how you name something. So if you discover a new insect or a new bacteria, you're going to pick your own name as long as it's unique and it follows a few conventions here. Okay, first is that you capitalize the genus word, and then the species not capitalized, but they're both italicized. So here we see Homo sapiens, it's for humans. Okay, you can see how we name cats, tigers. They all follow the same pattern of two words, capitalize the first one, italicize everything. That's how we're going to do it. Okay, so now if we're looking at these things, we see that, like again, at the very beginnings, the domain, that's just a very broad characteristic, and then we get down to the animals, mammals, primates, hominids, okay? And then we get down to the individual species, all right? So the pan troglodytes, all right, that is this animal right here, the chimpanzee, right? Paraceum, completely different thing. They're both alive, they both have a similar nucleus structure, but this is a protist, this is Ascelium, this is Paracilium, okay? So what we see is this is a very different, and the naming is the last two words, is the key thing we want to take away from here, okay? The reason we do this is because language is a tricky process, okay? Just in English alone, if you're looking at what do we call this object in English, it comes down to where you're raised and who taught you first how to name this thing. So is it a roly-poly? Is it a pill bug? Is it a potato bug? Do you have a word for it in some other language? There's a lot of ways we could describe this, and we need to make sure as scientists we are consistent and there's no confusion, that if we're talking about this, everyone knows exactly what we're talking about, okay? So their common names can be different and can be confusing, okay? Things like panthers and jaguars, not everyone uses those correctly. So even if you're naming it using the correct common name, it's not always guaranteed to be applied correctly. But if you have the binomial nomenclature using the Latin vocabulary, then scientists around the world will all study the same vocabulary, and all the scientists will understand this worldwide. Okay, so here we see the scientific name for that bug. So anyone who reads that is going to be able to search up that name, and they're all going to get the exact same result for the exact same species. Okay, so as we come through this, we're always going to go through the same process, the most general term, and then we get more and more specific until, like I said, we get down to the individual species. Okay, and those last two words are the biggies. Those are the binomial nomenclature. Those are the scientific names. Okay, these other pieces tell us a lot about how they act, how they behave, how they look, what they're related to. They're all important, but when it comes time for communication, it's the last two that really communicate something. Okay, so here we see the relative amount of similarities, and importantly, environmental science, the role they play in the environment. Okay, there's a number of different ways you can try to remember this. This class, we're going to have open note tests. So as long as you have them written down, I'm not worried about it. If you're ever asked to remember this, this is one way you can remember the order of the name. Okay, here it's Dumb King Philip came over for grape soda. Okay, so that is one way we can remember the sequence of the naming process. Okay, like I said, environmental science, we're not going to focus as much on that. We really want to know about a species. So a species is defined as the smallest, most specific group in a classification, and its organisms in the same species can reproduce together and their offspring are fertile. Okay, so that their offspring can have babies. That is the key test there. So one of the interesting examples of that is horses are one species and donkeys are a different species. You can breed them. Horses and donkeys can make a baby. They're called mules. Okay, so you can have a mule. It's a great animal. It's very practical. It's very useful. But mules as an entire group are all infertile. They cannot have babies. Okay, you cannot breed a mule with a mule. You cannot breed a mule with a horse. You cannot breed a mule with a donkey. None of them have babies. So they are not a species, and it gives a clear definition that horses must be a different species than donkeys. Okay, because they cannot make offspring that are also fertile. Okay, so that's true for a number of different things. There are all sorts of insects and other things that we could cross to test that as well. Okay, so as we go through this, we can see that what this is going to do is we have one big long family tree of all the different species that exist on this planet. Okay, there's a lot of them, and some of them see very little difference from their ancestral pieces here, but the fact is they're all alive today, so they all show some level of diversity and uniqueness from their ancient predecessors. So if we look at this, this is current day, okay? As we go farther and farther back in time, we see where the genetic differences split. Okay, so one of the most amazing ones for me is sharks are significantly different from fish. Okay, so they both live in the ocean, they both swim around, but when you look at the presence of bones and the bone structure for sharks versus bony fish, it is very different. In fact, bony fish, their skeletal structure looks a lot more like amphibians and primates and crocodiles and birds than it does like sharks. So they're closer related to us than they are to sharks. All right. So what we see is the newer traits come up along here. Now, sharks have also developed their own traits along this path. So it's not like they were stuck in a single moment. It's that they diverged and they took a different path some point in the distant past. Okay. And like I said, we can't cross species. So once the features have changed, there's no going back. They might share similar looks. Okay, so what we see is that things like sharks and dolphins might both swim, but dolphins should be over here with the mammals. Okay, so they can be gray, they can swim, but they have bone structures, they have limbs, and amniotic legs, eggs, they can make hair, they have live birth, they have all these different traits that are significantly in common with other mammals and significantly different from sharks. Okay, so that's how we get cladograms, and that's one way we could start the sorting process. Okay, we could also use dichotomous keys, which is again useful for naming and for that categorizing. But we really want to focus on communicating accurately with their name and understanding their role in the environment. Okay, so what are some of the words we need to know for this whole process? Okay, this is the big categories that different life is placed into. Okay, so you're going to notice that animals is only one of the categories. Prokaryotes is a completely different category. Okay, it's one of the simplest organisms. No nucleus, the DNA is loose inside the cell, and it's mostly just bacteria. Okay, so if prokaryotes just have DNA floating around, eukaryotes have a nucleus that contains the DNA and protects the DNA. So these are much more likely to undergo changes within their DNA because there's very little to protect them. Okay, so they can change against their environment whether they want to or not. They're very susceptible to mutations. Okay, eukaryotes try to insulate themselves from change literally with this membrane around the nucleus. Okay, so once we have the eukaryotes are going to be all the sorts of things we're used to seeing. Maybe protists, but also fungus, plants, and animals all fall within this eukaryotic structure. So that's the very top breakdown of domains. Does it have a nucleus or does it not have a nucleus? Okay, and then from there, we can look at how does it eat. So now we're starting to talk about some phrases we hopefully look familiar to an environmental science group. Heterotrophs, different eating, okay? So they're eating different things. So this fish used to be a heterotroph, used to eat stuff, and now this bear is also a heterotroph. It is eating something to consume nutrition, okay? Autotrophs automatically feed itself. So this is like the plants, okay? Again, these can be heterotrophs or autotrophs. Some of them are only one cell, unicellular. Okay, so now we're taking different categories and we're applying them against each other to try to make a grid of different categories. Okay, so multicellular would be more than one cell. Okay, and then we can take those either singular or multicellular organisms and we can see, do they have a cell wall? Okay, so everything has a cell membrane, by the way. Cell membrane is the outer covering that's flexible that all organisms have a membrane. Okay, and it has one job, to let the good stuff like oxygen and nutrients come into your cell, and all the bad stuff like viruses are supposed to be kept out. So that's the membrane. But if we look at stuff like plants, fungus, bacteria, they have a cell wall in addition to the membrane that holds its structure. So that's why a plant can stand up even though it doesn't have any bones, because it has a cell wall. Okay. So now we can also compare motile. So is it mobile? Can it move? Animals, some bacteria, some protists can all move. Okay. As opposed to plants cannot move. You don't see plants walking around or moving from place to place. They might float or get pushed somewhere, but they are not going to move on their own. Okay. All right. And then we can look at genetics. So the reason why we do all these things, if we go all the way back up, is to try to set this up. Okay. So we want to be able to start asking questions. How many cells does it have? Does it make its own energy? Is it autotrophic or heterotrophic? Can it move? Okay. The more we can do that, the better we can get at identifying organisms. Okay. So this is why we're going through all these different categories. So reproduction is one of the big categories to look at. So whether it's you or your cat or plants or any number of things, they tend to have, plants I'm talking about tend to have two different parents. You had two biological parents as well, okay? So this is what happens. By the way, some sexual reproduction takes place outside of the parents' bodies, and they don't touch. So there might be some frogs or some fish. One animal comes down, the female, of course, lays the eggs and then leaves, and then the male comes in later and sprays its gametes and its sperm across the eggs, and they fertilize it. So they don't necessarily have to be touching or in the same place at the same time, but there are two of them, both adding half of their genetic information to make the offspring. Okay, but compare that to bacteria. Bacteria, actually kind of like skin cells or some of the cells inside your body, can go from one bacteria to two bacteria, okay? And from two bacteria into four. They don't need two parents to give genetic information. They can just keep splitting in half and dividing and making new offspring that way, okay? Now, there are some disadvantages in the environment in that they don't get as much genetic diversity when they do this, but they also have the advantage of being able to reproduce very quickly. Okay, so if you're thinking about there's some bacteria on your food, if just one individual bacterial organism hits your food and it's like, ooh, I like the temperature and I like the nutrient source, I'm going to split, I'm going to split, I'm going to split, I'm going to split, and all of a sudden your food is covered in bacteria and mold. That's why. Okay. All right. So that takes us through the process here. Now we can look at the assignment. Okay. The assignment lists all the big different categories and asks all the questions of what's happening here. So if we take this grid, you should now be able to answer these questions. Okay. So that was the big assignment. Looking into next week, you're going to be asked to do this island biogeography with bird seeds. So the bird seed material is really nice. You just need like a handful of bird seed. You're going to be throwing it across the sidewalk. Okay. And what we're trying to model here is what happens on islands or different new biomes. Okay. So if we have islands close to the shore, some animals are going to be able to cross the barrier and get to the new place and start building up their population. And some animals are going to be slower. We're going to see more diversity in some places than the other. And if we do some things like move it farther away, we'll see this one builds up more diversity and faster than does the other one. And there's all sorts of parameters we can do to control this, okay? So that's what you're going to be doing with your birdseed experiment, okay? So keep that in mind as to you're getting birdseed this weekend, and we'll be doing the lab next week, okay? And in the meantime, complete your classification assignment, all right? And with that, have a good week, and I'll see you next time.